text spends a fair amount of time discussing the communication methods that exist among animals, non-human animals. Importantly, box 2.1 on page 13 illustrates Hockett's design features. Now, Hockett was a researcher back in the 1960s who described at least these 16 features that are specific and unique to human language, but also required, in his view, in order to demonstrate language. Obviously, a lot of research has been done since Hockett's original proposal here of these design features. But surprisingly, Hockett's features have remained a valid standard against which we can compare communication forms in animals to see whether they actually are or are not something that we could qualify as language. Now, of course, these are inherently humanly biased design features. And if we were to find that another species of animal had a method of communication that didn't uphold these standards, that would not mean that that was an invalid form of communication for that species. But we, as humans, could define for ourselves that that is not what we are going to call language. The one noteworthy exception to my previous statement that all of these design features hold true in all human languages is number one, the vocal auditory channel does not in fact have to be used. As we see in the case of signed languages, information is communicated using a visual modality. That said, it's only from our enlightened perspective that we can say that signed languages don't need to have vocal auditory channel, because during the 60s and 70s it was commonly thought that signed languages were versions of pantomime, that they were not full-blown languages. And as the chapter mentions, William Stokey was the researcher at Gallaudet University that changed people's perceptions all across the country that signed languages actually had all of the features of language that were required in order to be considered a language, except this first requirement, vocal auditory channel. So to date, there are no known species of animals that have developed what we would consider to be language. But I will talk next about those things that we have found among animals. First, the chapter describes bees. Bees have a method of communication with each other that incorporates at least three aspects of a source of nectar. Specifically, the direction in which the nectar is located, the distance that it is, and the quality of the source. And if you look at that figure 2.1, you can see how those three things are communicated. Depending on how long the bee walks in a line, whether he will waggle his butt in a dramatic fashion or a slow fashion, and which direction, which angle he walks in. Now, this is obviously a valid system of communication. It works for the bees. It accomplishes what they need to accomplish. However, we can't consider it language because it's limited in what it can communicate. If the bee wanted to talk about the nectar source that it found, man, the jackpot last week, Bill, you remember that one? Whew, I loved it. They couldn't do that because they can only talk about a nectar source that currently exists that they want another bee to travel to. In other words, if you look back at Hockett's design features, it does not have the feature of 11, productivity. Productivity is the ability to say things that have never been thought of before or never been said before, and bees just don't have that ability. The next animal that is described in the chapter is primates, but I'm going to come back to them in a minute. First, I'm going to talk about birds. Hockett's design features 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 9, and especially 12 and 13 are exhibited by birds. You could asterisk those in your text if you want to. But I'm going to talk for a second about number 12 and 13. Number 12 is traditional transmission. It says here the specific language that's adopted by the user has to be learned by exposure to other users of that language. Its precise details are not available through genetic transmission. We see that among some animals, primates in particular, that all of the vocalizations that exist among that animal are only are fixed and genetically determined, that they cannot productively create a new alarm call, even if it's learned from another animal. They can't produce some sound that's not already genetically pre-programmed inside themselves. Birds don't have that limitation. They can learn birdsong from their parents. In fact, must learn the birdsong from their parents because it is not genetically bred into them. Also, number 13, duality of patterning. Duality of patterning is the ability to take smaller units of auditory output and combine them together in unique ways to create more complex structures. So in human language, we compose our words of individual sounds, and we compose our sentences of individual words. Among birds, we see that notes can be combined together in unique patterns of ways that can be strung together in more and more complex sequences of song. Importantly, however, birds do not have number 7, feature number 7, semanticity. Semanticity is basically reference to the fact that individual units of sound refer to some semantic meaning. They have an underlying meaning. They represent something in the real world. And as far as we can tell, birdsong doesn't do that. Birdsong is exclusively used to attract mates and to repel other males from the vicinity, from their own territory. Now we'll move back to talking about primates. We found in human primates that there are two major pathways by which vocalizations can arise. The first is an affective pathway. This affective pathway refers to the kinds of vocalizations that are automatic and genetically pre-programmed that I talked about just a second ago. Some examples are primate alarm calls, like vervet alarm calls. Also, among humans and other animals, crying, laughing, gasping, crying out in pain. Those kinds of vocalizations are automatic, reflexive, and genetically pre-programmed. Across the world, laughter in humans means the same thing. It's always used in a fixed manner, and it does not need to be taught or modeled for young children. They will exhibit it regardless of whether they have ever heard somebody else laugh. On the other hand, humans have also shown that they can use what's called a cognitive pathway, or in other words, a method of processing information in the brain that is voluntary, non-genetically pre-programmed, and has the ability to be productive. In other words, that new thoughts or new information can be communicated that has never been expressed before. This cognitive pathway is entirely missing among non-human primates in the wild. However, there have been several studies that are cross-fostering projects where the infant of one species will be raised by adult members of another species. And in some of these cross-fostering projects, chimpanzees have been raised as if they were human infants by human adults. And in some cases, these cross-fostered infant chimpanzees were raised by adults as if they were hearing children, and sometimes as if they were deaf children. And the reason why they were raised as hearing first was because we wondered whether chimpanzees could learn to speak if they were given models, human models, to teach the language. Interestingly, one example of a cross-fostered chimpanzee named Vicky was able to learn to produce just 4 words: mama, papa, up, and cup, and she couldn't even say those very well. However, she could understand lots of other words that her parents would speak to her. She just couldn't produce them. Given Vicky's experience, some other people cross-fostered chimpanzees and raised them as if they were deaf children using American Sign Language. By using sign language, chimpanzees were able to communicate much more productively. They had a lot more capacity to be able to communicate. However, they still were only able to produce rudimentary sentences, what's called telegraphic speech. Now, if you're not familiar with telegraphs, the reason it's called telegraphic speech here is because telegraphs were a formative method of communication that was somewhat laborious, and many of the articles of speech were removed when communicating via telegraph. One famous telegraph that was reported after the Wright brothers' first successful flight was "Successful 4 flights Thursday morning." No elaboration, no articles of speech included, just bare bones of language. Chimpanzees who were cross-fostered, as if they were deaf infants, were able to learn many signs, as many as several hundred signs. However, they were not able to use these in as productive a way as humans can use them, suggesting that Hockett's design feature number 11, productivity, is not found among chimpanzees in the wild, but can be observed to a limited extent among chimpanzees raised by humans. Finally, the chapter mentions in brief some other animals, especially marine mammals, who have been able to mimic human speech. As far as we can tell, the marine mammals that can mimic human speech don't understand what it is they're saying, but I will post for you one seal named Hoover, who was able to mimic a Boston accent of some of his trainers, and adopted some interesting phrases that he used in a water park where he lived.